Lieutenant General Shankar sir very graciously agreed to also join us yesterday. So I will be keeping my presentation very short. I'll just be presenting a short introduction of how we understand the BRI so far and a very brief summary of some basic things that were discussed at the BRF that happened on the 17th and 18th of October, and what just setting the tone for today's discussion. So next slide. So basics first. The BRI was announced in 2013, and it was Xi Jinping's big breakaway from Deng Xiaoping's previous strategy, which believed in HIDA capacity and BIDA time. But Xi Jinping was, as we all know, a very different leader, and he was very out there and sort of in some sense aggressive as well. And the BRI was all about giving China visibility in the global stage, giving China visibility in terms of being a nation and China claims that the BRI has created 420,000 jobs or above and lifted 40 million people out of poverty. Largely, we identify some motivators for the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative did aim to create a stable ground around Xinjiang and Tibet, which, as you know, they are very unstable provinces in China, and they are filled with insurgency and things like that. And the Chinese government has been attempting to stabilize investment and supply chains around that area. There is also a strong belief in economics that a 1% rise in infrastructure can actually lead to a 1% increase in GDP. And because developing countries around China are quite weak in having our own infrastructure and getting loans from the IMF and the World Bank, they surround the Washington Consensus that sort of impose a liberalized economic regime on these host countries. And there is always a quid pro quo in these loans. So what China wanted to do was create concrete assistance to developing countries that would allow them to emerge and improve their economies without interfering in a lot of their domestic affairs. At least in paper, this was the strategy. China also attempted to secure long-term supply chains for energy, channeling routes from Central Asia and things, so that it is their energy security is not threatened. So the next slide displays a map. This depicts the Belt and Road countries, and you can sort of see the flow of how the Silk Route might have looked. The next slide is also a map, and you can see the amount of investment that China has put into different areas of the world. You see that the most has been in around East Asia, 17.6 billion US dollars, and then the next around West Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa as well. So these are really key parts of the BRI, and correspondingly we can also see that the greatest number of BRI countries are in sub-Saharan Africa, followed by Europe and Central locations for the BRI. Next slide. So there have been some evolutions in the BRI over the past decade. It started out as the One Belt, One Road strategy, moved to the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's going to keep changing. So far, what we've seen is around 1.01 trillion worth of investment and construction projects in about 148 countries around the world. Even though China claims that there are 150 countries, the last two, there is some haziness as to whether they are really, in fact, part of the BRI. Chinese loans have actually grown to a quarter of their own GDP, and they are also suffering from bad loans in several countries. This is also referred to as a debt trap, where the host nation is unable to pay the country back and honor its sovereign agreement. We can also see, if we take a look at it, even though China claims that it is a friendly nation that will cancel a lot of its loans, the number of cancelled loans is very minimal, and loans are maximum, they are deferred, or terms are renegotiated to still leave the host countries in a difficult place. Recently, Laos and Indonesia, from closer home, they have been severely impacted by debts from energy projects to China. Overall debt to China has increased in several countries. In places, it's crossed over 20% of their own GDP. But we see that China's foreign lending has gone down a bit since 2016. And because of geopolitical changes like the strain between US and China, countries have also become wary of getting too close to China. Very recent changes have been in the form of shocks. COVID-19, Russia, Ukraine, and the trade war with US have been the major crises, and these have changed global markets. So this has put developing countries in an even more difficult spot to repay loans, and this has generated new criticism for the BRI. Countries like Pakistan, Ghana, Zambia are heavily indebted to China and do not know how to pay the loans back. China's own economy is also faltering. There's been a lot of unemployment on the rise. So there has been a little bit of pushback from its own citizens for this kind of increased investment abroad. You also see that in some ways the Belt and Road Initiative is flexible, but it points to the fact that there's really not much of a coherent development plan behind it, because they pretty much just go with what comes. So after COVID-19, they initiated a health Silk Road, but here we actually found that in terms of the financial agreement, there was limited grant assistance, and all the vaccines were commercially priced, and these were actually often more unaffordable than Western vaccines. Over 15 large projects these were worth more than 2.4 billion US dollars. They've been facing financial difficulties, and Chinese overseas FDI has been declining over the world. Coming to the recent meeting, we found that yes, a lot of leaders came, but a fewer foreign leaders have attended than the years prior. And this means one of two things: that maybe the initiative may have not been taking off too well, maybe it's waning, but it may also be due to the big global crises that are happening in center stage right now, like the Israel-Palestine and several crises. There is a big drop in the number of European leaders that have attended, and these have not been offset by many additions from the developing world. So we see some disillusionment may be possible. With Europe, certainly that is the case, particularly because of how China is cozying up to Russia despite the Russia-Ukraine war. Xi Jinping famously claimed that blueprints have been turned to reality. And he's talking about how the China Development Bank and the China Bank of Export and Imports have set up 48 billion US dollars for finances. He again reiterated his stance against unilateral sanctions, economic coercion, decoupling, or supply chain disruptions. Basically, everything that the West, and I mean India too, we've been speaking about decoupling from China. He's sort of reiterating China at the center of the economic order. And there's also been a lot of emphasis on shifting to a cleaner BRI. So this is what's been discussed in the Belt and Road Forum. Now, I would like to invite our first speaker, Mr. Subramaniam Sridharan, sir. Thank you, sir. You can discuss your talking points for today.
China has always been angered by criticisms against the BRI, aimed at the BRI, which characterized it as an insidious Chinese attempt to extend its influence. China has argued, on the other hand, that such criticisms are targeted at the genuinely good intentions of China, were meant to contain the peaceful rise of China, and were prejudiced. So who is right? I seek your indulgence to recall a few non-BRI related but fundamental aspects, though, before we dive into the topic. We are a nation of specialities. We tend to think a problem is either economic or political or military. It is hard for us to understand. We have to be able to do military and political and economic, all simultaneously. Thus spoke, as far back as circa 1958, one of the greatest modern practitioners of realism in international relationship, Dr. Henry Kissinger. I believe that it sums up pretty much what BRI is. I consider BRI as a grand strategy by the Chinese to replace the extant international order that would achieve their prime and very long-standing ambition of becoming the true Middle Kingdom, which would leave them as sole hegemon, displacing the US from that perch. I will come to explaining how this grand strategy by China a little later. But first, let us understand what a grand strategy is and what we mean by international order. Why did Kissinger say military, political, and economic? because these are the three significant means or levers of statecraft employed by any state. Above all, a state needs to be secure before it can go about the task of achieving any further goals. Any and every state, therefore, needs to ensure sovereignty, which is freedom to do maneuver in its politics or policies, safety, and territorial integrity. Safety here refers to internal stability, while territorial integrity refers to external stability. These three aspects of sovereignty, safety, and territorial integrity are therefore intrinsically related to the security of the state. All the other aims of a state, such as becoming a wealthy state with a large per capita, enjoying international clout, or wielding a veto power in the UNSC, are all subsumed under these three security-related concepts of sovereignty, safety, and territorial integrity. Now let us see what a grand strategy is. The history of nations has always been about this aspect, or more precisely, the lack of it. A grand strategy is how a state intends to employ the three grand levers of statecraft, namely military, political, and economic might, to achieve its three security aims, namely sovereignty, safety, and territorial integrity. There are few nations which have a grand strategy because it is difficult to visualize and implement, as it demands an unwavering focus in everything the state attempts to do. This is where China has probably scored. With this as the touchstone, let us analyze the BRI. My conclusion here is that the BRI is the medium for using the three levers of statecraft to achieve China's three security aims. While burgeoning trade since the 1990s, which was appended by China joining the WTO in circa 2000, brought immense economic clout to China, it is my contention that it is the BRI which brought it the other two remaining aspects, which is political and military clouts across the globe. It simultaneously weakened similar clouts of the existing hegemon, the USA. Though the Chinese dynasties have constantly spoken about how heaven has chosen Han Chinese to civilize the rest of the world, which in their outlook was barbaric, it was only with the assumption of power by CCP in circa 1949 that a formal approach towards that goal was designed. When Deng Xiaoping took over power as the de facto paramount leader, he spoke of invigoration of China. His successors Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao spoke of great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. In fact, such a rejuvenation has been spoken about from the early 20th century by Sun Yat-sen and others. In the Sinocentric view of the world by the PRC, amply and clearly enunciated by Xi Jinping in the Third Belt and Road Forum on Wednesday, 2 days back, when he said, China can only do well when the world is doing well. When China does well, the world will get even better. This very clearly proves the linkages between the BRI and the Chinese grand strategy. The Russian President Putin, who was the chief guest, went a step further to say that BRI was aiming to form a fairer multipolar world, clearly espousing what the goals of China are and are therefore the grand strategy. Xi Jinping cleverly married the external goal of Middle Kingdom, which can be interpreted in modern parlance as regional and global hegemony, with the internal goal of the Chinese dream of a powerful and wealthy state, Fujian, to be achieved by China in circa 2049. As far back as circa 2013, Xi Jinping, speaking at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, after announcing the Silk Road Economic Belt, SREB, that was how BRI was called initially, at Kazakhstan, said that the Chinese dream was about wealth and strength. Wealth and strength were needed because Jiang Zemin had spilled the Chinese tactics a decade earlier when he said, intimidate with force and seduce with money. So we can see a continuum of the grand strategy. When UNCLOS announced its verdict in circa 2016 on the Indochina Sea, the European Union statement could not even name China because the BRI-dependent countries of Greece and Hungary would not agree because both had been beneficiaries of BRI investments. A year later, Greece even blocked a European Union resolution condemning action against the Chinese dissidents. No wonder that in the latest BR of 2023, 2 days back, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said Hungary will continue to be a trustworthy friend and partner of China in the European Union. Hungary opposes decoupling, severing supply chains, and the so-called de-risking. China used gray zone tactics, including coercion and seduction against the Philippines, the original litigant in the UNCLOS arbitration, to make it submit to itself. Later, President Duterte said, "I will throw the UNCLOS verdict in a wastebasket." Within 2 weeks of the UNCLOS verdict, China revealed a new set of missiles that were a warning to littoral and foreign navies. In the case of India, the coercion to join BRI was subtle. First, it tried to revive the idea of Panchsheel in circa 2014, thereby offering an olive branch. Next, it even offered to change the name of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor suitably if only India could join. It is my contention that BRI has strengthened and emboldened Xi Jinping in his pursuit of regional and world hegemony. It is also my contention that BRI was specifically tailored for this purpose. We will now see how the security architecture, which we had seen earlier as safety, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, is being achieved along with BRI. On the question of safety, Xi Jinping behaved like a successful snake oil salesman, both to the CCP and the Chinese at large, by depicting his vision of Chinese dream as an achievable goal, provided they stood shoulder to shoulder with him and accept pain and pressure in the process. He thus laid the foundations for the internal economic and political reforms, with himself being at the top, unquestionably. Xi Jinping made CCP all-pervasive, installed surveillance cameras everywhere with facial recognition features which could identify any of the 1.4 billion Chinese instantly, introduced the concept of social credits, and relentlessly pursued all opposition to nip them in the bud using all the apparatus of the state, including anti-corruption efforts, new cybersecurity laws, new espionage laws, new security and maritime security laws, etc. China also built other safety-related projects under the rubric of BRI, such as the Gwadar-Kashgar oil pipeline or the Kyaukphyu-Kunming oil and gas pipeline or the China-Mongolia-Russia gas pipeline. On the question of sovereignty, Xi Jinping took momentous decisions as soon as he came to power. He attacked India twice, once in 2013 when his prime minister was in India in May 2013, trying to gain India's support for the yet-to-be-announced SREB, Silk Road Economic Belt, and the other when Xi Jinping himself visited India in 2014. These were not attempts to possess Ladakh or Arunachal Pradesh, but were more coercive tactics to make India accede to SREB. Then he junked the verdict of IT laws in the Indo-China Sea issue. The Indo-China Sea is important to China for its anti-access area denial tactics. The Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, the Arabian Sea, and the Pacific Ocean are critical too. The ICS was deftly brought under the Maritime Silk Road, MSR, by offering to construct various ports and waterways related projects under BRI, such as ports in Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Pakistan, Djibouti, etc. While some are naval bases like Ream in Cambodia, Djibouti or Gwadar in Pakistan, and others such as Hambantota or Colombo East Terminal or regular ports, the latter can serve dual purpose in times of need. China also proposed the Kra Isthmus project in Thailand and the Malacca port in Malaysia, both of which now stand cancelled under international pressure. On the question of territorial integrity, the third pillar of the security architecture, he made significant progress. It was he who, against international objections, converted the shoals, reefs, and islets of the Indo-China Sea through reclamation into security bastions with air bases, radars, and missiles. He has not hesitated to be very aggressive and coercive, whether it is Ladakh or Arunachal Pradesh in India or Taiwan, Natuna, Spratlys, Paracel, Scarborough Shoal in the Indo-China Sea, or the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. Though the Indo-China Sea or Ladakh and AP, Arunachal Pradesh, do precede the BRI, it is the BRI that emboldens Xi Jinping. For example, Pakistan's debts to China under BRI alone amount to 1/3 of its total external debts. Pakistan kicked out the Port of Singapore Authority, PSA, and handed over Gwadar to China. Apart from these, there have been occasional and certainly orchestrated demands within China for the 3 million square kilometers of Chinese lands now claimed to be under the possession of Russia and claims over Outer Mongolia, etc. China claims to be a near Arctic nation, though the nearest Chinese port is 2,500 nautical miles. In concluding, therefore, that BRI is a grand strategy for China to become regional and world hegemon before the middle of this century. I only ask a rhetorical question. Is there any country, including the Dharmic India, with altruistic intentions when it announces grand schemes as genuine good intentions to modernize needy countries? There is no such altruism anywhere in the world. It is therefore China is also trying to metamorphose its BRI into more acceptable and sophisticated proposition of global development initiative. She therefore announced it in the UN in September 2021 and later at Davos too, unlike SREB and MSR that were announced in Kazakhstan and Indonesia. He has also simultaneously announced Global Security Initiative and Global Civilization Initiative relating respectively to military and political domains. Therefore, the three grand levers of statecraft, which we started with, namely economic, military, and political, are being slotted into GDI, GSA, and GCI, respectively. Some say SREB was initiated to find outlets for overproduction in China following the stimulus package of $1 trillion that China infused into the system after the 2008 financial crisis. Others say it was meant to develop the hinterland of China, as only the coastal regions of East has benefited from opening up the economy. Some others say that BRI was an attempt to transfer Chinese indebtedness to other nations. While China always works with multiple aims, and all this could also be true, I am convinced that there is another more fundamental aspect, as I have outlined. With that, I rest my case for grand strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for detailing how much and how we must examine if something is a grand strategy or not. That was very well argued. I'll now move on to the next speaker, and I will be keeping discussions to the end, so we have a little longer to discuss. Hariharan sir, could I request you to speak about the BRI in the Indian neighborhood? So this is really relevant to how India must perceive the BRI, because we are also big investors in our the countries that near us. So if you could discuss this, sir, thank you.
I think Sri has stolen the thunder. So I won't dwell upon the points he has brought out on the BRI forum, but I will carry out what you call SWOT analysis, what they call strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats to BRI. Firstly, there was this photograph, 3 photographs on successive BRIs, which was displayed on the Twitter. It is going around. You can see the, in a battle with tanks, I am sure General will be bearing me out. There used to be a technique called separating the infantry from the tanks. So the mines are laid. Like this, the BRI has now separated which are the countries which are likely to go along strategically with China. In the third picture, you can see even that there are some stragglers. In a battlefield, you always find stragglers who will not be joining the battle, like Italy, which wants to get out.
Sir,
If you see this strengths, it has clearly identified 3 streams. The strength is from the first BRI to this session of the BRI forum. South America has come in a big way. It has gained, China has gained strategic access to South America. Earlier, it was only limited to Cuba. Now others have joined in. And the other continents in Africa, Zambia has come out in strength. Tanzania has problems. Kenya has problems. And but the big wigs in Africa are missing. That is Nigeria, the access to what you call the basic raw material for Chinese industry is assured thanks to Africa, particularly in Central Africa. And the Francophone countries have also now reneged on, that is on West Africa. They have reneged on France. So it is favorable to China now. So China, I think, has overall strategically more focused now. Where will it go? Because the capital is less. Chinese economy has not fully recovered. So when the capital is less, it has to go to successful projects rather than what you call basic management principle of business is reinforce strength, same as military principle. Don't reinforce a loser, but muster in support for a successful project. But in South Asia, it is over-invested in Pakistan. So it is trying to get broaden the BRI reach from Pakistan to Afghanistan and ultimately, I suppose, to Iran, and it will definitely be a strength as far as I am concerned, provided they can manage the US to keep away US from Pakistan. There is an outreach of US I can see in Pakistan. This is as far as it goes in the western part of South Asia. In the northern part, you see the Nepal. Nepal is actually over-dependent on India. So it will try to reduce it. But geophysically, China's projects have come to grief rather in Nepal. From the Tibetan border to Nepal, the access has come down due to poor quality construction. These will be strengthened. And also in Arunachal also, you can see across Tibet. So what does it show? China will use both Bangladesh. Burma is over-dependent on China. Right now, the Burmese army is losing against the insurgents. That is the national federal government of Aung San Suu Kyi. So the opportunities in Nepal are more attractive for China. We should be careful in handling this situation. We cannot take it for granted. Similarly, in Indian Ocean, if you see, Sri Lanka is vulnerable, but not to that extent as Indians generally believe. I believe we have far greater strategic reach than China can ever achieve. I am saying this with confidence because China has to support a long line of communication. So, logically, Burma, Bangladesh can, to a certain extent, reinforce the Chinese in Sri Lanka. So I from my strategic perspective, the military guys can correct me. I feel China will not let go in Bangladesh because right now Sheikh Hasina is making a bid for re-election, and India is backing her. China is in a dilemma because Americans have slapped sanctions on Sheikh Hasina's forces. That is the Rapid Action Battalion. So China will try to use leverage in Bangladesh in the election, but there is no suitable, viable candidate has not emerged in Bangladesh. So I still see across the horizon, we are stronger in Indian Ocean right now, and how we will maintain it is to be seen. As a South Asia man, I see Maldives is overestimated, Maldives election results. I do not agree with many what we call doomsday men saying everything is lost to China. No, not at all. Maldives is totally dependent. I am sure the naval guys on this panel will vouch me out. So the still Chinese will try to bribe their way through. They have done, and there will be pinpricks. It will increase. We can expect, and then come to Afghanistan, a subject by itself, and Pakistan, another subject by itself. Within the short span of time, I will not be able to deal with this. But one thing I want to say, Diego Garcia will be activated. I can see in the coming, the American base will come back to life because Middle East situation is getting worse and it suits Americans. Earlier also in the Gulf War, they have used Diego Garcia, which is a good sign for us. And the French also, the Malagasy and Reunion are there. I am sure the French also will be actively watching. We have agreements with the French to use our bases, mutually use our bases. So this is the big picture I see. I have discussed the threats and opportunities also. So I think we should keep our eyes open, not only focus on China, but focus on the strategic developments around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that succinct presentation, sir. Now I'd like to move on to another region. Tanvi sir, could I request you to talk about the BRI in Africa? Africa is one of the most important regions for the BRI. So I would love to hear from you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, good morning rather, everybody. I apologize, I don't have a presentation prepared. I sort of prepared my notes at short notice and I will be referring to them in my notebook here. So yes, BRI in Africa. And I think it's important now to talk about the BRI because just last month, we marked the 10-year anniversary since the launch of the BRI. And it's interesting now because 10 years down the line, the Chinese slogan for the BRI is small is beautiful, right? And there's a lot of reasons why there's been a sort of, restructuring or right sizing of BRI ambitions. One is, of course, because of the domestic situation in China, right? Because the economy is in trouble. There is a real estate crisis. There is the, crisis in tech. There's Xi Jinping's extreme heavy-handedness in the economy. There's a demographic crisis. There's all sorts of economic and political crises in China that's actually limited not only Chinese ability to spend on the BRI, but also Chinese willingness. But while it's important that those of us who look at the BRI from the outside and we say, what, this is probably a good thing because now that China is going to be spending less money, it means its influence is going to come down. We should be wary because what China is now doing is it's reprioritizing its efforts, right? Instead of going towards big infrastructure projects like railways and highways and ports, it's now looking at investing heavily in tech, especially tech in Africa, right? Obviously through Huawei and other tech giants in China, which, as per Chinese law, have to sort of provide its source code to the CCP and the PLA. So we have to now look at the BRI and especially the digital Silk Road through a different lens, right? But let's look at what's been happening in Africa over the last 10 years of BRI. The first question I was asked to speak about is, what do Africans or African locals feel about the BRI? Look, and we need to look at this question in context, right? The African, continent is no love lost for the West. In fact, time and time again, they have said that, when America comes in with its aid, when Europe comes in with its aid, it always, starts with the lectures on human rights and the sort of morality lectures and so on and so forth. When China comes in, it just comes in with the checkbook. They don't care about human rights. They say, here is the checkbook. We're building you this dam. We're building you this this port. Thank you very much. So obviously, do I believe that this build back better world is going to be a sort of counterweight to the BRI? No. Because the West doesn't have the ability to match Chinese funding, especially over the last 10 years. And certainly, it does not have the ability or the willingness to do so, given its, political imperatives towards human rights and so on and so forth. So at least in the beginning, the African attitude towards the BRI was overwhelmingly positive, but that has soured over the last decade. And there are cases here, and I'm going to sort of, read out a few cases. For example, in Nigeria, protests erupted in 2017 over the lack of compensation for buildings demolished for the Lagos-Ibadan railway line. In Uganda, local traders protested against Chinese traders in April of 2017 for setting up small businesses when they had come on and instead promised to invest in existing businesses. In Tanzania, 2,000 people were forced to relocate, leading to the suspension of the Bagamoyo port and attached industrial zone. Ghana, which is interesting, 90% of the fishing fleet is currently owned by Chinese entities, which has forced the Ghanaian government to launch an investigation after severe protests. In Cameroon, protests erupted in 2015 over the demolition of houses for construction of the Kiribi deep sea port. What else? In 2018, Sierra Leone cancelled a $400 million deal to construct the Mama airport from China over protests. In 2020, China pulled out of the proposed 1,050 megawatt coal-fired plant in Lamu after severe protests. Ghana also cancelled a sort of an intelligent traffic management system, which was supposed to use Chinese tech, and it was backed by Huawei in 2020, which was supposed to be funded for $100 million. And this is the most important, and what I'm about to come to. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, the President Felix Tshisekedi has asked for a review of mining agreements, jeopardizing the 6 billion minerals for infrastructure deal that the country has with China. And why is this important is because China, the DRC is home to the largest cobalt mines in the world, right? I mean, all the lithium that goes into your Tesla cars, into your batteries, are mined from these mines. And there was a fascinating article that I read in the New Yorker, I think it was a year and a half back, and it basically documented life in one of the largest mines in the country, in the Kolwezi region, basically. And this is a Chinese-owned and operated mine, and the human rights there are atrocious. And this sort of lends into the second question: has it generated jobs for locals? So let's take the Kolwezi mine as an example, right? You've got men and women working in the most egregiously terrible conditions, working long hours, no safety, right? And what we've seen is rampant drug use, rampant prostitution, and then subsequently a rise in sexually transmitted diseases, right? And there is enough, circumstantial evidence to suggest that these Chinese companies have sort of perpetuated this sort of drug use and prostitution simply because whatever meager wages are being earned by these laborers, they then spend back on drugs and, well, the prostitution, right? So sort of money comes back. In fact, there was the reporter who actually traveled there, the New Yorker reporter who actually traveled there to document life of the working conditions in the mines, actually saw an African laborer being tied up and then whipped by another African with a Chinese sort of foreman screaming "Tiga," means again. So it harkens back to that sort of colonialist era that we have. So certainly it has generated employment, but not in a good way, right? And it's pretty big, I think, for the DRC to sort of in 2021 ask for a complete reevaluation of the mining agreements that they have with China. So certainly it's bought in a fair set of projects, but it's not sort of bought out the returns that they expect. Now let's look at some of the statistics here, which I've mentioned. You take Kenya as an example, right? I mean, in 2017, under the BRI, China invested $522 million. In 2022, it was $216 million, and in 2023, it's only $12.7 million, right? It's estimated that the African continent needs $170 billion per year in infrastructure alone by 2025, and China is no longer in a position to sort of spend that sort of money. What else do I have? Yes, so basically, and again, if you look at the African continent as a whole, China spent $28.5 billion in 2016 on BRI projects, and in 2022, it spent only $1 billion. So we can see a significant drop in the amount of money that's actually being spent in this region, right? But as I said, China is now repivoting away from large-scale infrastructure projects to telecom, to projects in the telecom sector, right? And they've already committed to financing telecom projects in 70 African countries, most notably Angola, Burkina Faso, DRC, Ghana, Lesotho, Madagascar, Mozambique, Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia, right? And in fact, very recently, they completed a new data center in Senegal, which is again completed with servers supplied from Huawei. So I think this is something to be more worried about, because tech is big, and if you have these Chinese companies with a backdoor to African tech feeding to the CCP and then feeding to the PLA, which by Chinese law and Chinese constitution is mandatory, then it's something certainly to look at from a sort of geopolitical perspective, right? Now, what do you say? China claims, as was said in the presentation, that the BRI has led to 420,000 jobs and overall lifted 40 million people out of poverty, but there's no independent study that's actually verified it. Again, it's very difficult to verify because a lot of these BRI projects are shrouded in opaqueness, right? They're not transparent at all. In fact, the one thing we know is that 35% of BRI infrastructure projects around the world have stalled or have encountered major implementation issues because of corruption, scandals, and labor violations, including rumors that China imports its prison population to complete some of these projects. Again, it's conjecture, but it's certainly, there's no smoke without fire. So it's again something to really think of. And it's very interesting because from 2000 to 2018, $152 billion worth of loans and lines of credit were extended to 49 African countries. So obviously Africa was a very important region for China in terms of investment in infrastructure, but now they no longer have an opportunity to sort of match that investment and match that infrastructure, right? But where the BRI, I think, is faltering, we have to also take into the fact that private enterprise is thriving, because as of 2022, there are still around 10,000 Chinese enterprises in Africa generating about $180 billion in revenues. So that's still huge potential, right? And we shouldn't discount the role of the private sector when we're talking about the BRI. That's important. So it's not as if China is completely retrenching from Africa. They will still commit to tech. Private enterprise is continuing to grow and thrive. And China will continue to sort of engage in the region. So another question I was asked is it, what do you say, is Chinese investment in the region a geopolitical threat? Look, I think there's a study, and I'm struggling to find the name of that study, where they actually looked at about a handful of BRI contracts, right? Because again, BRI contracts are notoriously opaque and very hard to get access. And what they found was that these BRI contracts are heavily lopsided and go against the recipient country. So what these BRI contracts say essentially is that they cannot be made public. The host country cannot criticize China bilaterally or in any multilateral institution, nor can the host country veto China on an important vote, right? Should the host country, the recipient country, fail to meet its debt obligations, then sovereignty issues come into play. Then China has the right to nationalize that particular project, whether it's a port or a railway or what have you, and use it for its own ends. Now, how enforceable it is a question, because it's in a different country, it's in a sovereign country, but certainly that clause is there. Another clause in these contracts is that the courts of arbitration are in China. They're not in some international court or international mediation. The arbitration will take place in Chinese court. So these are very, very heavily lopsided BRI contracts. In fact, it is very clear in these BRI contracts that these contracts cannot be submitted to the IMF and the World Bank or any other multilateral institutions to restructure debt, in case these host countries are actually going for debt restructuring, which is why when we look at, for example, Pakistan and the contract signed for the C3S, we don't see those contracts come to light. When Pakistan goes to the IMF or the World Bank for a loan, one of the things that they ask for is, show us these CPEC contracts, show us how leveraged you are, but these things never really come out. So that's how insidious these BRI contracts are. So certainly, yes, it does present a geopolitical threat, because we don't know at this point what the second and third order effects are of these countries defaulting and how enforceable these contracts are. It's anybody's guess, but it is certainly very scary, right? I mean, look at for example, if you look up for debt, let's look at Djibouti, for example. China owns 85% of Djibouti's external debt, right? And as a consequence, it now has a naval base in the region, right next to Camp, or maybe down the road from Camp Lemonnier, the American base, where it can now keep an eye on its what do you say, on oil, sort of, transiting the straits. Now, again, it's a very far-flung overseas base. There's a question of maintaining it and logistics and so on and so forth. And I know Dr. Venugopal sir loves to talk about maintaining far-flung naval bases, but it's still a naval base, and it's still something to be reckoned with. Another example is China owning 72% of Kenya's external debt of about $60 billion, right? So certainly it is scary for one country to control such large amounts of debt of another country, right? It's simply something to think about in terms of the long-term geopolitical implications. So yes, do I believe it's a debt trap? Again, there are people who disagree, there are people who agree, but I believe by and large that it's not good to put all your eggs in the Chinese basket. Eventually, your chickens will come home to roost, right? Another question I was asked to speak about is Africa in the G20. Will Africa in the G20 change? I think, look, it's too early. I personally am not a big fan of multilateralism. I don't believe in it anymore. Again, this is a personal opinion. I believe that the UN and a lot of these multilateral institutions were put together at the end of the Second World War, which represented a very different geopolitical reality. And that geopolitical reality is no longer relevant, right? You have powerful countries like Brazil and India, right? And Vietnam and some of these growing economies that are not adequately represented. So when you're not adequately represented, how are you going to be fair to countries who have a right to be there, to be at that table? So I'm not a big fan of multilateralism. I don't know, or I can't speak to what the major accomplishments of the G20 have been. And I don't know how relevant the African Union joining the G20 is going to be. I think only time will tell in that regard. Ultimately, I think it's a question of how willing are countries to open their purse strings towards Africa. What are they willing to spend, and what do they expect in return? Let me give you a very good case study of India and Mauritius, because I live there.
I'm so sorry. If I could just cut time being, because we've overshot the time, I'll definitely get back to you. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, I'm out. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Very much, sir.
Yes.
Now Would invite Lieutenant General Shankar sir to speak. Since I didn't have questions for you, but I think it's a really good time for you to jump in with what you think, and then we'll end with Vasan sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks a lot. We've heard three speakers so far mentioning the details of the BRI. But I will give you an assessment of the BRI the way I have looked at it always. Why did BRI start? What are the aims of BRI? Like someone said, it was to realize the Chinese dream. So, what is the Chinese dream? We have to understand that. The Chinese dream was to have a economy which was the best in the world and to establish a Sinocentric world order. As simple as that, two things. How was the BRI going to help that? The BRI was always going to help that because all its surplus would go out to all these countries. The manpower would go out and get employed. Profits would come back, and raw materials would come back to fuel the Chinese engine and keep its economy growing up. That was the first way. And the second way, it was very simple. We always spoke of debt traps. So all these countries, poor countries, which were in part of the BRI, would become part of the debt trap and be ever, faithful to China, if I may say so. So these were the two aims. And and I'm putting it very simplistically without going into many details. And if you look at it, the prime area which was targeted was generally Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa. Europe was an afterthought. East Europe, yes, the poorer countries. It was generally the global South which China targeted. Why? It was the global South which had the energy and didn't have the money. Right. So they went there. Then what has happened after that? Right. And concomitant and simultaneous to this investment, mega investment which took out, we must understand that this was the first of the initiatives which China started. The BRI was of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. Then came the communication initiative, right, global communication initiative, where they wanted to structure who's to be doing what in communications, so that it favored the Chinese. And then came the global security initiative, followed by the development initiative, and now we are talking of the civilization initiative. Right, all this has happened. Let's see, has BRI helped the Chinese economy? Obviously, it has not. If China is in tremendous trouble, and yesterday I was listening to a very illuminating talk by a guy who spent half his life in China about the end of the China miracle. If the China miracle has ended, a large part of it goes to the BRI, which could not generate the kind of funds which would offset Chinese structural problems. I mean, this is something which is critical to understand. China had its own internal critical problems, which were evident, not from now, it was evident from around 2010 or so. Its demography was a problem, and a demographic decline was on the cards, which China didn't do much about. Right? The ideological revanchism which Xi Jinping started was also pretty evident, and the Chinese economy was to go down. That was also almost predicted from a long back, and other issues. But the BRI was to offset all that. Did it? It has not. And we are very clear now that the Chinese economy has stalled. Okay. And someone spoke of revival. I don't think the Chinese economy will ever revive. It might stagnate. It might remain a big economy, but I don't think it will ever, revive and become the booming economy which it once was. In fact, the global predictions, and I go with it, I've done a bit of research on that, is that China will never overtake USA. And it might be a huge economy, but there are huge chunks of non-productive economy within that. And 30% of it is this property sector, which is only going down day by day. Okay. If it didn't, help China in its economy, has the BRI assisted China in getting global say? Now, like, in fact, Madhu, I've sent a photograph to you on your thing. If you could put it up,
I
this is
just
the photograph which Colonel Hariharan was trying to show everyone. If you could put it out, it is illustrative. So let's look at the influence part and the global influence and the Sinocentric world order. 10 years down the line, everyone knows Sinocentric world order is a fraud and no one is going to no one is interested in it. Even the the African countries are not interested in it. Right. Tanvir Jayakishan did mention a lot of countries which are having second thoughts about BRI. I could go on about the whole lot of them, but that's a different story. Now, these 140 countries are not going to vote for China or are not for China in any global initiative. Right. That is also very clear. They might not vote for China in the UN tomorrow. Okay. Let's see if China has become the prima donna in global affairs. Okay, this is the photograph. Colonel Hariharan said, isn't this the photograph which you wanted to show? If you're listening, right? So this is the photograph of the first Belt Forum. You see the number of heads of states who were there. The second Belt and Road Forum, the number of heads of state have reduced. And the third Belt and Road Forum, it has reduced even further. The only handful of people who have gone there actually. Though 140 countries are represented, it is only hardly a few heads of state have gone there. And yeah, thank you. This is all as far as the presentation goes. So in terms of influence, people are not today, heads of state are not even willing to attend this Belt and Road Forum. That's obvious from that photograph. And has China made the difference either in the Ukraine war or in the ongoing Hamas-Israel war? Is a big question mark. In fact, it's not a question mark; it's a failure. Right? China made a huge cry about diplomacy in the Middle East deal that it's brokered with Iran and Saudi Arabia, but that's almost coming unstuck. And I'm sure by the end of this West Asia crisis, you'll see that coming unstuck. Okay. China also sent a special envoy to Ukraine and to Russia to disengage and finish the, to get the Russia-Ukraine war to a closure. But no one is bothered about it, to the extent that 4 days back, Joseph Borrell, who's the head of the EU, has said, look, the way we respond with China will be the way China behaves with Russia and how it behaves in this Ukraine war. So, period. So, the one place where the set of rich countries which can refuel China's economy are staying away. And de-risking and decoupling are almost irreversible today. It doesn't make business sense to go to China anymore. Okay. So, that influence is gone. The second part of the story is look at Middle East, where China has to get almost 50% of its energy. China, we know, is an energy deficient country, right? And it's also a food deficient country. It doesn't have the kind of food security which probably India has. India, in fact, is a surplus country, or USA, or for that matter, Russia. So at no stage has it, is anyone prepared to accept it as a superpower of any kind. So it has not been able to influence. Today, it is actually running around Middle East trying to shore up, ensure that its energy supplies go on. Because if energy supplies don't get interrupted, then there's a problem back home, right? They say Israel and Hamas should go to a two-state solution, but no one's going to listen. And by going, China has tilted a little towards Palestine, in which the Israelis are not going to be very happy about, and China needs Israel hell of a lot for technology. The technology links between China and Israel are pretty deep, and that might snap any day, right? If this thing goes further. So China is at risk. What many of us don't understand, and the general trend I learned from listening to everyone, that China is this great predator, like an octopus going all around with its Belt and Road initiative. It is not. It is at huge risk. Now, let me focus back on the South China Sea and the Western Pacific. This Belt and Road engagement is maximum in Southeast Asia. And it is there, it has got maximum problems also. Everyone thinks it's going to gobble up, Taiwan. But gobbling up Taiwan is not the issue. Today, the biggest problem China has is with Philippines, where there are problems on the South China Sea over the Scarborough Shoal and the Thomas Shoal. Right? Every day there's a problem between the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippines Coast Guard. And with USA having gone back there with 4 bases, the thing has to be shifted. We all focus on Africa. We all focus on back home, about Sri Lanka, which is the poster boy of the BRI these days. Right? We don't understand the problems it has created for itself at its doorstep. And a large amount of this is through the BRI. Right? So as of now, I don't see this BRI going anywhere. BRI is, as a vehicle of global influence, out of question. BRI as an economic revival of China is also out of question. Yeah, China is shifting to the digital infrastructure route, which I think Tanvir did mention about the, going in to control the communications of those countries. Big is small, small is beautiful kind of a story. But let us see where it goes. I don't think so. And as far as we are concerned in India, I think we've done damn well about this whole story. We've told them to take a walk during the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, which was held, which was presided over by India. We gave them a boot in G20. We also gave them a shut-up call during the BRICS, right? Which was in South Africa. In all these 3, what did we do? We ensured that this BRI phraseology and talk shops don't enter the actual declarations which were there. In fact, China had no role in all. China had a lot of role, but their signature, phraseology didn't come into this whole story, right? So that is where we are, and we have also assisted Nepal to shrug off from the BRI. It will not shrug off because the Pokhara airport is heavily indebted and it cannot. But then these days Nepal is, backing off from the BRI. Sri Lanka is a terminal case. We've assisted Bangladesh to not to be over dependent on, the BRI. So this business of string of pearls, which was supposed to be tightened as a result of the BRI, I think is breaking off slowly. And we also have to consider the BRI with a little more confidence, right? For the simple reason that while the BRI is a transactional proceeding between one nation and the other, it is bilateral between China and other nation. The forthcoming IMEC, notwithstanding the problems of West Asia, have greater promise. It has greater promise because the food corridor between India, UAE, and Saudi Arabia has already made some headway. People have made investments into it. The corridor going up to Europe might take some time, but the internal corridor, as far as the rest of the things are concerned, will come through once this business of the conflict in Palestine and Israel die down a bit. Right? I'm confident. And once this comes, it's going to be a huge wedge in this area, because the moment this corridor comes, the security of the corridor is incumbent on the participating nations. And who are the major participating nations who have military heft? It is USA and India. And once that happens, you'll see right from the Gulf of Aden right up to Bombay, you'll see a whole lot of military activity, which actually puts Gwadar on a limb and splits off Djibouti. So this is where I feel BRI is going. BRI will continue. Let's not also shy away from the fact that the BRI has gained a lot of influence to China. But what will that influence turn into something profitable for China is something which one has to see, right? But the last point is BRI is something we'll have to continue to keep contending with. You can't wish it away. It's there in 140 countries. We'll have to see it with all its attendant problems. It might not be a success, but it'll be a thorn. So the way China has a huge economy and as a stagnant economy, it'll continue to stagnate. and not grow. But then if you have a obese character around, you can't wish him away. It will be always in your sights. Right. With this, I'll close in, and any questions, I'll take them on at the end.
Thank you
Thanks a
very
lot.
much. Thank you very much. That was a very succinct presentation, especially at such short notice. Now I'd like to invite Commodore Vasan sir to discuss the BRI and the maritime domain. Vasan sir?
Thank you, Madhu. First of all, I would like to thank all the panelists for being here even at short notice. We were planning to do this before the BRF, and I think Colonel Hariharan rightly said, why don't we do it after this so that there will be some kind of an indicator. But even if we had conducted it before the BRF, we would not have gone off track because all the indicators that were required were already there. So I also must like to thank General Shankar for setting the context in terms of what are the origins, what is the genesis of BRI, how did this come about, and what is it that China wanted to achieve. Likewise, Sridharan, I know as usual, comes out with an academic brilliant explanation of what is BRI, how is that, I actually did not use the term Marshall's Plan, but in many analysts, they have also said, is it something akin to the Marshall's Plan? So there are questions about, and Colonel Hariharan looked at the issues related to our neighborhood, particularly Nepal. I think General Shankar also spoke about what's happening in Nepal. And what's come out clearly with this new airport is that though Nepal does not want to tag it as a BRI project, China is very keen to label it as something that is because of BRI. So, and also it's already non-profitable. They were expecting a phenomenal number of tourists. That footfall is not there. And so therefore, this is a similar story, that echoes in many parts of the world as you look at BRI investments. Must also thank Tanveer for bringing us first-hand accounts of what's happening in Africa. For almost centuries, if not decades, we've been saying that Africa is a happening continent. And that's where we said, we needed to invest. And China was, of course, ahead of all of us. It went and invested. But, it does not still have the kind of equations that India has due to cultural, historical relations of how we engage with the African Union and other countries. And the fact that in G20 we facilitated admission of Africa is something that should augur well for our own projects. So, since most of the things that I wanted to cover in terms of the very genesis of BRI, the kind of impact that is there, etc., and all this has already been covered by the distinguished panelists. Let me now go straight on to some of the slides that I have, which is mostly related to the way in which China has tried to expand its influence through the maritime Silk Route. This is where there has been a phenomenal, if you look at the map, it's quite clear as to the importance of both the Pacific as well as the Indian Ocean region for connectivity, trade, commerce, and people-to-people contact. This is not today. It's happened through historical ages for centuries, and that's how the continents and the civilizations came together. And it's only a question of, as I've always referred to the BRI or the Silk Road as old wine in new bottle. So it's the Silk Road which existed through the Central Asian Republic right up to Europe. We've had the Maritime Silk Road, right from the times of Zheng He, Admiral Zheng He, who had his expedition some 700 years ago. So this clearly tells you that you must grant it to Xi Jinping for the imaginative way in which he wanted to, as General Shankar brought out, to use the additional money that he had in his kitty, which was virtually gathering dust. That's something like $3.2 trillion. So, and the return on investment was near zero. So, whereas now by taking this money out and investing it in this destination on the premise of improving connectivity, commerce, infrastructure, hinterland connectivity, China obviously scored certain points over here. And more importantly, whether they lost money or whether they made money here, the fact is that they have a presence. There's a global presence across continents that cannot be taken away. I think even General Shankar acknowledged this fact that you have to live with BRI. So there is no choice but to live with BRI. But at the end of the third BRF, as you saw from that, each picture is worth 1,000 words. And those three, BRF1, BRF2, BRF3 photographs of the leaders who participated clearly tells us that there is diminishing interest in the way people want to engage with China on their terms. That is important for us. Because even Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka is a classic example who is quoted everywhere. Now, even Laos for that example, something like 91% of their GDP, their GDP is I think about $15 billion. 91% of this is towards debt of China. So, how are they going to pay back something like 91% if, in the future? Also, which Tanvir also brought out, is something which is secretive, and that there's nothing that allows the contracting countries to disclose the contents, because that will tell you how opaque the entire transactions are. Some of the contractors which have been analyzed by second-hand accounts, third-hand accounts, clearly tells us that the kind of money that they have put in, most of it comes back to China, way of contracts, by way of equipment that they buy, way of technical manpower that they provide, and in many cases, even the menial labor has been provided by China, and therefore the so-called job generation, employment opportunities in these destination countries are near zilch. Next slide. Yeah, so this is red. Next. So you can see that this is the kind of presence that it has established, not necessarily only through BRI, but BRI is an added instrument that has allowed this to establish equations. I think Mr. Sridharan, Tanvir, and even Shankar, Colonel Hariharan spoke about the new initiatives, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Cultural Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, now the Global Influence Initiative, which I have coined some time ago. Now, all this is actually the GDI, GSI, GSA allows China to embark on the GII, which is the Global Influence Initiative. And so how does that happen? You bring companies there, you invest heavily there, you have your presence, they are interacting with the governments and the private companies which are there. Therefore, indirectly, you are gathering data and you are wielding influence in these areas which are of importance. So these flags which are there clearly tell you that there is a global presence. It's not that America does not have similar presence. When you compare the kind of military installations that they have around the world, China comes nowhere near this. But that's a fact, and therefore I go along with the assessment of General Shankar that China will remain stagnant and US will maintain its lead in terms of being the number one power militarily, strategically, politically. Next slide. Yeah, so this is Djibouti, of which Tanvir has spoken about. You see it's in this important critical area, but it's not just China which is there. You have Americans, you have French, you have everybody, every other navy of any description which is there. And Indian Navy has its own counters in terms of keeping these areas under surveillance. But for China, it was obviously the need to fill the gap in terms of its serious lacunae in supporting its long extended lines from South China Sea to African coast or Indian Ocean region, where it required some kind of a presence to protect its energy interests, its strategic interests, its political interests, and its commercial interests. Next. Now, these are some of the photographs of the areas where they are investing heavily. Next. I can come back to this if required. This is Gwadar, which is important to us because this has the potential to change the energy equations. The idea was to have a commercial port managed by them, which it is doing, and to have oil coming out of Straits of Hormuz by being pumped right into Xinjiang province. That's where the importance of this connectivity comes in. Next. So this is, of course, the Katpu port. A lot more developments have taken place, and we can go into this. But these are what is happening on the ground, not necessarily because of BRI, but because of the strategic interests of China in keeping ports in Indian Ocean region, in Africa, and Mediterranean, across continents under its control in one way or the other. Here again, it's important to see that the Global Communication Initiative, though there is no such term, is to ensure that technologically you facilitate these countries to connect through their equipment, which allows them to carry out eavesdropping, which has happened in the case of Huawei in many countries. And in one case where they heavily funded one of the parliamentary building, every compartment there was, connected to the eavesdropping stations which are around. Next. Okay, this is another port which tells you what is happening along the entire Makaran coast. And so therefore it's a question of presence, which changes the, as I've always maintained, the present equations in the North Arabian Sea. Because you're looking at new players which are Iran, Turkey, Pakistan, Russia, which has exercised with them together. And all these people, when they come together, the so-called sea control capability of the Indian Navy is challenged. Next. Okay, so this is the summary, and Madhu, since I can't see very properly, I want you to read out each of them and stop for 10 seconds.
Sure, sir. So first is a decade of disruptive, productive, game-changing initiative.
Yeah, what I meant was that, whether you like it or not, the fact that they have the ability to invest this kind of money across continents gives them certain leverages. And after all, every developing country, including India, wants foreign direct investment. So this is what they are using to see that they are able to have their presence and, perhaps subjugate these countries through the economic route, through other diplomatic options that are available. Again, here, it's always good to quote about how a flag follows trade, and that's what they're trying to do over here. Next.
150 partnerships with developing countries.
Yeah, no, this is something which has a long-term dimension to their dream, the Xi's dream of 2049, where, in the 100 years of CPC, there are specific targets, and each year is defined as to what they want to achieve. And so all this would definitely enable them to have influence operations in these countries, engage them with them militarily, strategically, economically, and try and achieve their objectives, which is to be the #1 country by 2049.
Used as an instrument of economic engagement, diplomacy, coercion with long-term strategic objectives.
That's very clear. So we can move on to the next. We have covered some of this earlier.
Initial euphoria has given way to cautioned approach by recipient countries as it is proven that very little benefits have accrued. It's win-win for China, compelled big and medium players to create alternate systems such as B3W, IMAC, AAGC, BDN, etc.
This I think is an important dimension which we must not ignore. If China had not invested in the BRI, if had not used all that money which was lying in its reserve, would it have been easier for these countries to invest in alternate systems? I do not think so. The fact that they wanted to contain China, they also had to invent new instruments of economic engagement, which is why, back B3W, AAGC, IMAC, whole lot of things are coming about. So which I think is good for the larger connectivity paradigms that we keep discussing. So therefore, on one hand, you should be thankful to China. They may not have succeeded in the entire concept of BRI or the MSR, but that it has given way to new opportunities for the democracies and developing world. And those with money is an important point that we should not ignore. Next.
Xi's pet dream will doubtlessly be tweaked to make it more lucrative. The declaration that it will not invest in thermal plants along the BRI and negotiations to rework on the burden.
No, I want all of us to remember one thing here. Remember that previously they said we are committed to green energy, but we have no qualms about exporting thermal plants. In fact, along the entire China POK economic corridor, many of the thermal plants that were envisaged were polluting thermal plants with outdated technology. So obviously, when they look at the new challenges, they have realized that this will not be something that will be accepted by the rest of the world with their commitments to green energy. Therefore, now I think in the last declaration, maybe about 2 weeks ago, they clearly said that they are not going to invest anymore along the BRI in thermal plants, which is a good sign. So let's look at both the good, the bad, and the ugly dimensions of BRI. So it's from that point of view, I wanted to highlight this aspect of their so-called commitment. I'm not sure that they are not going to be violating this, but at least on paper, they're trying to say that we are going to respect and honor the global commitments to green energy. Next.
The trillion-dollar investments are required around the world to build better lives, and the competition between China and the rest actually may facilitate a new South.
No, see, I think, India has taken a lead in terms of shaping the voices of the global South, and therefore we require more money. Let's face it. Does India have the money? Does US on its own have the money? Or the willingness to part with this for aiding projects around the world? China has done it and they are the first. So let's grant it to them. So how does it matter to me who spends the money, as long as the overall development standards of people, their prosperity, their own living happiness index or whatever you want to call it, and their GDIs and GDPs, they move forward. We should be quite happy, but it cannot be at the cost of their independence and at the cost of the so-called things that we have seen as far as BRI is concerned, in terms of debt traps, in terms of subjugation, in terms of political interference, in terms of prioritizing China's interest. Therefore, these people are virtually under their foot or thumb. So that's what we wanted to avoid. But any kind of investment in any developing country obviously is welcome. And therefore, if China can do it on its own, the rest of the countries have to come together, whether it is because of the IMAC or the AGC or the Build Better World or whatever you call Blue Dot Network. It cannot be done on its own. So let more democracies come together and provide that there are alternatives for people to choose. That's the way we should look at it.
Thank you, sir. If we could end on the last point, India is unlikely to support the BRI in any form and will join many other initiatives while improving its position economically and diplomatically.
Yeah, this is self-explanatory. At the times, we are quite clear right from the word go that we will not endorse BRI or BRF. And these are on two specific counts of, one is the sovereignty clause which are affected, and the other one is about the unilateral nature of these contracts which are drawn up, which does not help developing people. So this, I'm very happy that we have not endorsed BRI. Tanveer and others who have been a Colonel Hariharan, Sridharan all know our consistent stand as far as this. We used to have huge discussions within the C3S in some members who are not here today, who vehemently said we must support the BRI. But I'm very happy that we did not, and our stand is vindicated by the happenings around the world in the last 10 years. Thank you, Madhu, and thank you all the panelists for your time.
Thank you. Now, if we can bring it to the discussion session, I'd like to request all of you to turn on your cameras so we can have a discussion. I wanted to keep the floor open for any comments between the members itself, and once that is over, I will ask a few questions. Anybody has any comments to make about another member's presentations or anything?
Yeah, Madhu, what you can do
I
is
have nothing, Madhu.
bring some questions for each of them from your side.
Yes.
And
yes,
then
that
let
is,
it
yes, that is the plan. So if there are no comments, then I'll jump into what Vasan sir concluded, that India has not supported the BRI. And even initially, when we had a sort of dalliance with the BRI, we found it very difficult because the projects enacted by China were too big and did not really benefit the local population. So the Indian stance has been very clear. So if I can aim the first question towards Sridharan sir, I think you made it very clear, sir, how the BRI can be interpreted as a grand strategy. I wanted to, taking off from what Vasan sir said and what Tanveer sir said, do you think that countries around the neighborhood, do you think that there is an alternative to this? Do you think Western loans or other kinds of investments offer something that is not a strategic strong arming of these countries, or do you think it's similar across different countries, and Indian position is this way because we have a difficult border situation with China, and rightfully so, because we're looking after our own interests? Do you think other countries have an alternative?
Madhu, see, if you look at the overall, investment in our neighborhood, any investment for that matter should have a certain return on investment, or it should have some social contract or responsibility towards ameliorating poverty and things like that, which cannot be measured in tangible terms. In terms of return on investment, bilateral or multilateral investments will always look for some positive return on investment. Without that, they are not going to invest anything. Say, take for example the Hambantota port, or the or similar, or Laos, Kunming, high-speed rail, or even the Jakarta Bandung, high-speed rail that has now been started. So all these projects are not technically viable. Like for example, Indonesia has hidden debt today of almost $18 billion to China, just a hidden debt. So most of these hidden debts come because China, instead of lending to a sovereign state, also lends to state-owned enterprises in order to, reduce, or in order not to show that there's a huge amount of debt, towards China. And so these are hidden debts which anyway a sovereign country will have to bear the cost later on if that state-owned enterprise defaults. So what I'm saying is that investment will always have some, safety aspects involved. And China has not been, very careful about these things. In fact, China wants to flout all these things in order to gain influence. So it's an influence operation at the end of the day. So that is why I am saying that whatever, for example, India lends loan to China, to Sri Lanka at the rate of 0.2% or 0.3%, whereas China lends at 4% commercial lending rates. So what I'm saying is, at the end of the day, the investments have a certain requirements in order to be made, and China flouts them. And the concerned countries are having corrupt, leaders, or leaders who simply don't care. For example, if you take Maldives, the previous prime minister simply, took just 1 hour in the parliament to have the FTA with China ratified. He went through 4,000 pages of the FTA document in 1 hour in Parliament. How can it happen? The members of Parliament were not even given copies of that FTA before. So essentially, these are all corrupt leaders, and the leaders who don't have the interest of the country in mind, who are responsible for that. The traditional investment patterns have been good. Of course, there are some geopolitical considerations that might have created some problems, but I don't think, China, any of those old, investment strategies were bad.
Thanks, sir. Ramani, sir, you had your hand up. Do you want to comment? Hariharan, sir? Is he audible? Sir, you're
He's
not
not
audible.
audible, Madhu.
Okay, so if I can just wait while Hariharan sir is getting his audio working, if I could ask Tanveer sir. So, do you think that since there is so much rising debt in the African region, and we also have players like the IMF, the World Bank, and there's been a lot of talk about delinking supply chains and shifting the influence away from China, right? Do you think there is a possibility that they may offer some bailouts, that they may offer something alternatives in that region to take back some power? Because there has been a lot, like I'd asked Sridharan sir, there have been a lot of these small initiatives, like India and Japan had signed something to provide investments, but these haven't really taken off. So do you think that there is any possibility that something may really come as a contender to the BRI?
Thank you. No, and this doesn't come from pessimism. This comes from pragmatism. Again, to match. Again, there are two things, right? One is infrastructure, which Africa desperately needs. There's no two ways about it. Connectivity, infrastructure. And when you talk about funding an infrastructure project to the tune of billions, it's not just giving the money, it's also oversight, right? To how are you going to manage it? How are you going to audit it? How are you going to make sure that every penny that has gone towards said infrastructure project is spent on said infrastructure project, right? What are the negotiating power or the negotiating capacity of these African governments, right? How will they be able to negotiate a good deal? What will the repayment terms be like? These are questions. So my thinking is, look, individual countries need to step up. Countries like India, for example, or even the US or the EU. And what these countries need to do is to say, look, we will fund this particular project, like the Chinese, or what India has done in Mauritius is, we will say, let's say we'll build you this railway. We will tender out Indian companies to do it. We will tender out European companies to do it, tender American companies to do it. That way we can keep a track on the project. We can keep a track on timelines, we can keep a track on schedule, and we will make sure that there is that accountability and oversight. And in return, we don't ask that we ask that you pay us this money only when you're good and ready to pay us this money, and you protect our geopolitical interests in the region. So I think that it would be smarter for countries to work bilaterally with individual African countries instead of trying to negotiate, say, with the bloc. I don't believe really that there is a BRI equivalent, or that the IMF or the World Bank is going to be able to spend, uh, you know, or match the spending that China had maybe 5-7 years ago at the height of BRI spending. Right? At best, what the IMF and the World Bank or these other institutions can do is bail out in case there is acute shortages of not just infrastructure, but if there's a national disaster, there's desperate aid that needs to be provided to people, right? Where there's a housing crisis, there's a health crisis, hospitals need to be urgently built. In that situation, perhaps the IMF or the World Bank is helpful. But will the IMF or World Bank now contribute towards an aspirational infrastructure project? Especially when the backers, which are individual countries, are tightening the purse strings owing to economic woes in their own home countries, is questionable. I think it's a wonderful opportunity, actually, for a country like India to get involved, not just in physical infrastructure, but also in tech, because India has, over the last, I would say, 2 decades, grown leaps and bounds in terms of its tech. UPI, for example, right, is a wonderful concept that you can export to Africa, paying on your mobile phones. A simple example, right? It's no strings attached. You give them the know-how, you build the infrastructure, and then, right, by managing that tech. Look at what Airtel has done, for example, right? Airtel is a market leader in several African countries, right? So it's a good. So I think that it needs to be a combination of bilateralism, with the country working very closely with private sector, right, to be able to accomplish this in Africa. Let's not look at these big banks, these Exim banks, these ADB. No, let's look at countries, and let's look at what the private sector has to offer, and let's look at what opportunities a country like India has to sort of capitalize in this time of Chinese retrenchment. This would be my answer.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Question was directed towards the general group. So it really feels that China is making up the BRI as it goes along. It doesn't really have a clear strategy. And I think this is the bane of investing in so many different countries. It's like using a one size fits all in different places where the contexts are entirely different. I think that's one of the major drawbacks of the BRI as well. So in this context, this is where we have things like the space BRI and the digital BRI. So I wanted either Vasan sir or Sridharan sir or anybody, Shankar sir, if you could comment on how far do you think these initiatives are going to take off? Space BRI, digital BRI.
See, can I?
Yes, sir.
Madhu, I can talk about the space BRI.
Sorry, sir. Shankar sir had said something. So if we can move from Shankar sir and then Sridharan sir on the space BRI.
See, BRI is now a political initiative, which is a pet project of Xi Jinping. You can put anything in front of BRI. You can call it space BRI, digital BRI, right? It doesn't matter. You can maritime BRI, silk BRI. All this BRI is more symbolic to represent Xi Jinping and his success. And it's part of their information campaign. Overall, the BRI in fundamental concept has failed. Now you call it space BRI, call it any BRI you want, it doesn't matter. Like what they're doing it in Nepal, the Pokhara Airport. Pokhara Airport started before BRI started, but they want to include it as part of BRI to make it a signature plan of Xi Jinping so that things goes up and then all that nonsense. So I don't think it's even worth discussing, to my way of thinking. We can have any
Thank you, sir.
on this issue. Right? Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Shall I move to Sridharan sir on the space?
Yeah, please. Yeah, let him speak.
Yeah, Madhu. When you say that it all looks disjointed and there is no sense of uniformity, or it doesn't appear to be so, and things like that, I disagree with that premise. The simple reason is when countries are involved in a grand strategy or a grand design, that strategy or design will appear disjointed to all of us because we don't know what that strategy or design is. And it takes generations for that design to be, sorry. Hello? Hello?
Yes, sir, you're audible only, sir. You can go
I'm
on.
audible?
Yes, sir, we can see and hear you. I think there's an internet issue on
Okay.
your end.
So when that, so
Yeah.
it will appear disjointed or not recognizable to the rest of us. But it takes generations before the design actually fructifies. So one generation of leaders passes it on to the next generation of leaders, and that is how it goes. The BRA, what we see today, is a culmination of what happened or what started sometime in 1949, or even before that, as I said in a presentation, that Sun Yat-sen's days in 1906, 1907. So they wanted to dominate the world, and they are using it as a tool to get influence or gain influence and dominate the world. Whether in the process they lose money or not is another issue. So that is where I say that space BRI is also equally important. What China has done is China is trying to increase its space situational awareness. Space situational awareness, or SSA, is something that is very crucial to any spacefaring nation because it identifies to you the objects that are in the lower Earth orbit or medium Earth orbit or geostationary orbit or the near Earth orbit or whatever. So because the space race is tending towards weaponization of space, SSA is a very important part of space activities of a spacefaring nation. And what China has done is, under the guise of BRI, it is creating Earth stations and Baidu control stations and things like that all over the place in many countries, including in Pakistan, for example. For example, Djibouti, they are trying to build a space port. That is, they will be able to send rockets like Sriharikota from Djibouti. So these are the activities that it is doing. And I will say that whether BRI, as we understand today, is something else from what China has been having in mind for a long time. That is what I would try to say. Thank you.
I definitely agree with that. I think in terms of leveraging things for geopolitical or strategic reasons, there is a clear pattern. Like you said, there is an emerging pattern. There seems to be motivations to what they're doing. I think I meant more in terms of from the perspective of the host countries. It is not very beneficial at times because they don't seem to have a strategy that is really focused towards what you had mentioned earlier, like a kind of altruism, or if not an altruism, even the mutual cooperation. It seems to be mired in a lot of mystery, and it's very opaque. So that is also the nature of my comment. Now I'd like to ask Vasan sir to make his comment.
Hey, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. I think I also tend to agree with some of the points that were made by Sridharan just now, because we are looking at a grand strategy. So there are many aspects of grand strategy, whether it is space, whether it is silk, whether it is road, whether it is anything else which is there. The point is that they have the money, they have the interest, they have a plan to achieve certain targets by certain time. Specific to the space Silk Road or whatever you want to call it, point is very simple. There is a technology that's available, and they are ahead of us in space, which we know. We in fact in all our conferences, it's come out clearly that they are quite ahead of us in space. So if the technology is there, and if you are making that available to the destination countries by whatever space Silk Road or whatever, slowly you are subjugating them. Unlike India, which has offered its SARC satellite, which is for benign purposes, for humanitarian aid, for telemedicine, etc. We are not looking actually at anything coming our way. But China works very differently. They want something, as was also said about the return on investment. It's important to get those return on investments. So for them, it is a strategic dividend. It is to displace USA, and it is to be the number one power by 2040. That's a grand strategy. So, you can either simplify it or complicate it by, analyzing each segment of why it's doing done and what are the derivatives out there. So, as far as the destination countries are there, there's a standard saying, all of us say beggars can't be losers. So even Habban Tota, for that example, was offered to India first. Were we in a position to take it? There are different reasons which have been given as to why India did not accept it. They thought it will become a competition to our own ports. They said we do not have the money. They said no. So a lot of reasons have been given, but the point is China beat us to it. So we can only blame ourselves for not looking at it in the long-term interest, strategic interest that would have been served by taking over Hambantota. But I kept China at bay. So every country has its own way of working to serve its long-term strategic interest. And China, definitely, we must acknowledge, irrespective of how we may not agree with some of the way in which they do, is that they are doing this and they are having leverages across continents, whether it's Africa, whether it's China. Of course, there is disenchantment from the countries, host nations, but what is the alternative? They want money. The elected leader in democracies would like to show that, the Tamil Nadu, for example, over here today is saying that we are number 2 destination in terms of investments. So obviously, it is something that they would like to showcase as their achievement. So who's giving it? Is China giving it? I know a lot of Chinese companies are coming to Tamil Nadu through ingenious ways. So these are things that we need to contend with. So again, I would like to say that this is an existential challenge to us in terms of what it will do in countries of our interest, in our neighborhood and in the distant neighbor.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. The final questions that I want to take is from Hariharan sir. He's asked what is the future of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation and how China, Africa, Iran, Pakistan will pan out in the next 5 years. Does anybody have anything to comment on that?
No, I have a lot of things to say, but let's have somebody else say things.
Yes, sir.
I'm sure Sridharan can say something
Provided
about
Pakistan exists after so many years.
Tanvir, you can jump in.
Anybody can jump in.
Tanvir.
Sir, could you repeat the question, please?
Yes, sir. So the future of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation and China, Africa, Iran, Pakistan, how these will pan out.
The future of China, Pakistan economic, you mean the CPEC, right? I think the CPEC, to be quite fair, I think that the CPEC is pretty much dead in the water, right? And there are many reasons why I feel this. One is because the region itself has become very restive with the Baloch Liberation Army and sort of wreaking havoc, targeting Chinese nationals. Become a pretty okay. Emergency alert. All right, on my phone. Very strange. Right. So I believe that from a security perspective, it's become very difficult for Chinese engineers and Chinese civilians to operate there. We know for a fact that a lot of these projects haven't been completed on time, are still sort of languishing because of corruption and apathy and bureaucratic red tape and so on and so forth. So I think it's just become a sort of white elephant. I'm not really confident of its viability in the long term. I'm not confident of Pakistan's ability to provide the necessary security and backing for it to be completed. And again, when we my sense is that it's just a sunk cost fallacy. China's going to keep throwing money into it in the hopes that they can get it completed in piecemeal. As for Asia-Pacific, Asia-Pacific cooperation, look, China has adversarial relations with almost every country in Asia. Right? If you talk about territorial claims on land, you've got the 10-dash line, which used to be the 9-dash line, and it's a desire to control all of the South China Sea. Its use of gray zone maritime fishing fleet masquerading as Coast Guard, or Coast Guard masquerading as a maritime fishing fleet. Right now, it has the economic ability to arm twist and bully a lot of these smaller countries that it has, territorial issues with, to trade with it. Right, because it is still the largest trading partner, and a lot of countries have no other choice than to toe the line, at least vis-a-vis trade, because the last thing they want is for China to turn off the tap or restrict imports from these countries. But I feel that this reality will change over the next 10, 15 years, because as China sort of retrenches inwards, as it starts to look at its own domestic crises, as it tries to start, because what is China trying to do now? They've said essentially that, look, we can no longer depend on external demand. We have to focus on domestic consumption, boosting domestic consumption. That's our only future, right? So as it retrenches, as it looks inward, increasingly looks inward, a lot of these countries which are beholden to it will now start looking at alternative trade partners, which is why I think it's so important. And I keep coming, because at the end of the day, we need to ask ourselves, where does India benefit? And I think that what India needs to do is, it has an opportunity right now to start negotiating free trade agreements with a lot of these countries, right? To provide viable alternatives for manufacturing and trade. And this is a big problem. India keeps dragging its feet. It's dragging its feet on an FTA with the US, with the European Union, with the UK. I mean, look at when manufacturing moved out of China, where did it go? To Vietnam. Why? Because Vietnam has an FTA with the European Union. India does not. So here, a country like India, which has the heft and the capability, must be a lot more proactive if it wants to sort of, seize on this opportunity, which will start presenting itself at least a few years, or maybe 5 to 10 years down the line, is where I believe. So, but the question is it ready? Because China certainly has sort of overextended. It's overheated, and its economy is now sort of cooling off gently. Not to say that it will not grow. It will continue to grow. It will continue to sort of move towards maybe replacing the US as a dominant economy, albeit at a lot slower pace. But there is opportunity here that I think that the country like India can capitalize on. This would be my sense. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Sridharan sir has raised his hand. So maybe we can end with that comment.
Yeah, very quickly, I agree with what Tanvir said. I also wanted to add 2 more points. One is that, the viability of, apart from the viability of CPEC, which Tanvir alluded to, I am also worried about the viability of Pakistan itself. Pakistan, will it exist as a country that we know of today, is a very big question mark. And secondly, whether there will have any land border between Pakistan and China anymore is also a question mark. It may happen that Pakistan does not have any more land border with China. And the other thing is about Iran. Iran is also again becoming a very constricted country, and it's going to lose friends a great deal, like the way its mentor China has lost friends. It has very few friends in the world. So this whole axis is going to be unviable, is my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Now, Madhu, please give 2 minutes to General Shankar.
Yes, sir, but General Shankar has...
Is it? Yeah, if not, you go ahead, please sum up and finish it.
Okay. Yes, sir. So I think from what I've heard today, we've talked a lot about how much the BRI has been, it's been very strategic in terms of securing access to different parts of the world, having countries perhaps make, not veto against China, having countries support China in the geopolitical forum. I think we've also spoken a lot about how Tanvir sir brought out how places like Africa, countries don't have negotiating power with a government like China. And what's worse is that we don't really hear about it, because all of these contracts are pretty much confidential and we don't have access to these records. I think personally for me, that is the biggest drawback and the mystery behind the BRI. And I think that has been the problem that has been plaguing the BRI for its entirety of its decade. We don't know the bidding process itself. For instance, our own neighbor Nepal has been very hesitant. It's backtracked a bit on a lot of BRI, a couple of BRI big projects, because it felt that Chinese companies, it was obviously the Chinese contractors that were getting the contracts to develop these projects, because the bidding system itself is very shadowy. We don't know if competitive practices are even at play here, and the project was overcosting, and they felt that the company was not going to deliver. So we see several narratives at this end, one being the geopolitical one, the other being the host country's own probably well-grounded suspicions that they're not getting a good deal, and China's own difficulty in engaging perhaps maybe with developing countries. So I think the biggest problem has been the lack of transparency. But with the Belt and Road Forum, what I'm seeing it's going in different directions. It is revamping its own projects. But the one comment we've not yet heard is how much more transparent it's going to get. And I think that is going to be the biggest problem or a point of downfall for the BRI. So I would like to end with that. Any other comments, please feel free to email these to me. I will be adding it in and placing it in the caption. So thank you very much to all the participants for joining. It was a very lively discussion, and thank you for answering my questions very succinctly. Thank you very much. I'll end the meeting now.
Thank you, sir.